Hello, everyone. Welcome to another episode of Dollar Dialogue. Today's episode 25, Commodities and Control, the tug of war for economic sovereignty in Latin America's trade markets with Mr. Rizwan Zaman. Mr. Rizwan Zaman is a very talented and hardworking individual at AISD. He's a senior right now and he's very much interested in political matters. In fact, he is a very passionate Model United Nations participant, and he won the most passionate award in one of the Model UN conferences in Singapore. He was Angola, and his representation of his nation was very well noted by the chairs, and that highlights how much of a passionate individual he is when it comes to political matters. And we're very glad to have him with us here today. Thank you, Mr. Rizwan Zaman, for joining us. Is there anything that you would like to add to the introduction that I've just said?
Thank you, Mr. Arif Malik, for your kind and wholehearted introduction of me. I would like to say hello to all the viewers that are watching this, and I would be hoping for a very wonderful discussion today.
Thank you, Mr. Rizwan Zaman, for that introduction. Now let's get on to talking about our topic today. So Latin American trade markets, it's very diverse in one manner that it entitles a lot of products, and it's also, you can say, in a way, very it's done by all of the Latin American countries which are Hispanic in nature, so they have cultural similarities with each other, and so I think we will see some cultural factors that plays a role in the commodities and the control they have over their respective commodities in their nations, because Latin America is very rich when it comes to commodities. Now when it comes to commodities such as oil and other such resources. So first of all, I think it's very important to talk about a little bit about Latin American trade markets before we talk about commodities, to get a macroeconomic perspective. So Latin American region is composed of major economies, and these are some of the world's most powerful economies in the world. And by powerful, I mean some of the largest economics in the world when it comes to GDP, such as Brazil, Mexico, Argentina, Colombia, Chile, Peru, and smaller but emerging economies like Ecuador and Uruguay. And Latin America primarily engages with the United States, the European Union, China, and other inter-regional trade. And China has become the leading key partner for many Latin American countries, surpassing the US in some cases. And despite global outreach, intra-regional trade through organizations such as the Mercosur Pacific Alliance is through treaties such as the Mercosur and Pacific Alliance is underdeveloped compared to regions like the EU or Asia. And one of the best examples I can think of is ASEAN, or in the EU, it's in the EU, the European Union. And as for the GDP growth, Latin America's average GDP growth was approximately 1.8% in 2023, down from 3.9% in 2022. And some of the countries which have seen significant GDP growth include Brazil with a 2.1% in 2023, driven by strong agriculture exports and services, followed by, and Mexico also had a very high GDP growth, around 2.5% in 2023, bolstered by a stable manufacturing sector and remittances. And some of the viewers might think that 2.5%, 2.1% is not that of a high growth, but compared to other Latin American nations, this growth figure is significantly high. For example, now talking about Argentina, which has seen a negative 2.5% economic growth, largely due to inflation and debt restructuring efforts. And Peru and Chile have been seeing slower economic growth due to lower commodity prices, particularly copper. And the inflation rate is a major concern for many Latin American markets, because the region has unfortunately seen high periods of inflation. For example, Argentina right now has one of the highest in the world at around 118.4%. Brazil, although the inflation is down to around 5% after peaking during the pandemic years, the country had a history of high inflation in the 1990s. And Mexico's inflation is controlled at around 4.5%, but some figures say that it's a little bit higher in some parts of the country. And as for the export composition of the Latin American countries, I think it's also very important to look at their export composition. For example, starting with Brazil, and Brazil is the largest, I think is the largest Latin American economy, and it's also one of the largest Latin American country, and it's one of the, you can say, it's a country that everyone knows because of soccer, or football, whatever you want to call it, and also because of the Amazon rainforest. It's a magnificent country. And Brazil is the world's largest exporter of soybeans, sugar, coffee, and beef. And soybean exports accounts for $45 billion, accounted for $45 billion in 2023. And also, it's a major player in the global iron ore market, exporting around 340 million tons annually. And China is the largest trade partner, receiving over 30% of Brazilian exports. And Mexico is also heavily reliant on manufacturing exports, essentially, especially automobiles and electronics. And automobile exports reached around $158 billion in 2022, primarily to the U.S. And Mexico is also part of the USMCA, formerly known as NAFTA. And 82% of its exports typically go to the U.S. and declining. And there are some declining oil exports in Mexico due to domestic demand and production issues. Oil still constitutes a significant portion, but only remains around 6% of total export in 2022. And as for Chile, Chile is, I think, is the largest global producer of copper, accounting for 28% of global production. And copper exports in 2022 were valued at $40 billion, with China as the top destination. And lithium, which is becoming increasingly critical because of EV vehicles and other such renewable technologies, with Chile holding nearly 60% of the world's known reserves, particularly, and this is crucial for the EV sectors very much. And Argentina, if you look at Argentina, it's also a major exporter of soy products, wheat, and corn. And soy exports reached $17.5 billion in 2022. And energy, the Vaca Muerta shale formation is expected to boost energy exports in the coming years, but development has been slow. And as for Colombia, oil accounts for around 30% of total exports, while with fluctuating production levels. And Colombia is also one of the largest top exporters of gold globally, contributing to 40% of the country's exports in 2022. And I think it's also very important to look at the import composition of these Latin American nations to understand about their trade markets. As for the imports, most of the Latin American nations import machinery and equipment, and Brazil and Mexico are actually significant importers of machinery, mainly from the US, China, Germany. And despite being an oil producer, Mexico is also a large importer of refined petroleum products, mainly from the US. And Argentina and Chile depend on energy exports to supplement domestic production, particularly natural gas. And countries like Peru and Ecuador also import a higher percentage of finished goods, electronics, and machinery. And I think it's also important to look at the trade agreements and regional blocs in the Latin American nations. For example, the Mercosur, which is between Brazil, Argentina, Uruguay, and Paraguay. It was formed to promote free trade and economic integration. And there have been trade disputes, internal protectionism, and different economic policies, even though this Mercosur exists. And the EU Mercosur agreement was an agreement that was supposed to be finalized, but it has been stalled for years due to concerns over environmental protection, particularly in the Amazon. And there's also another Pacific agreement and trade bloc in the Latin American nations, which is the Pacific Alliance, which is between Mexico, Chile, Colombia, and Peru. And it focuses on market liberalization, innovation, and attracting foreign investment. And it is less protectionist compared to Mercosur. And China and Japan are also key observers and growing trade partners. And then there's also the USMCA, United States Mexico Canada agreement, which replaces the NAFTA, and with updated provisions for digital trade, intellectual property, and labor standards. And Mexico also significantly benefits due to its close proximity to the US, particularly in manufacturing and supply chain integration. And I think a big growing influence in this trade part in the Latin American nations is China, because China has expanded its footprint, particularly through investments in infrastructure and natural resources. And the Belt and Road Initiative (BRI) also has provided a lot of Latin American nations a lot of funds for development, including Argentina and Chile, which have joined the BRI. And the China-Latin American trade has reached around $450 billion in 2022, with China exporting machineries, electronics, and textiles, while importing raw materials and agriculture products. And China has also invested heavily in the infrastructure and the energy sector in Brazil, while also it has invested in a lot of lithium and copper industries in Argentina. And also, China is also heavily invested in agricultural and energy sectors in Chile and Argentina and other Latin American nations. And as for some of the challenges that the Latin American nations face is Argentina, Venezuela, and Peru face political uncertainty affecting trade policy and foreign investments. And many Latin American economies are also highly dependent on commodity exports, which makes them a little bit vulnerable to global price fluctuations, which we're going to talk a little bit about later. And there's also a lot of rivalry between the US and China over trade domination in Latin America, because right now China is, even though right now China is one of, I think China has surpassed the US to be the major trading partner of the Latin American nations. There has will be some conflict between China and the US in making sure that one of the either is in lead when it comes to trading with these Latin American nations, because even though, yes, China as trading with the Latin American nation has grown, the US is also significant, is a significant power and hegemon over this region of the world, and China is growing its influence over here also. So that's a very brief introduction about the Latin American trade markets. Are there any opinions or any more information that you would like to add to the things that I've just said? Mr. Rizwan Zaman, Arif Malik, or Shazib Kareem? Shazib, I see your hand is raised. Would you like to add anything?
Yeah, sure, Arif. I'll chime in a bit. So I think, in my opinion, Arif, I'd agree with whatever you've said so far. And in my opinion, right now, if you're looking at the present, I'd say that Latin America continues to play a major role in global commodity markets, like from Argentina's soybean exports to Chile's copper and Brazil's vast agricultural output. But yet, these same resources leave the region vulnerable to external forces, as international markets and geopolitical strategies still have immense influence over how these resources are traded, priced, and controlled. Like, for example, take the case of lithium, a critical resource in the world's shift towards renewable energy and electric vehicles. Bolivia, Argentina, and Chile, from the lithium triangle, containing more than half of the world's lithium reserves. And this could be a game changer for these countries. But how they negotiate contracts with multinational corporations like Tesla or Chinese firms will determine if they can truly benefit from this resource, or if they'll fall victim to the classic cycle of resource exploitation. And uh, countries like Venezuela and Ecuador are heavily reliant on oil exports, and it shows how commodity dependency can become a double-edged sword, because when oil prices are high, these nations experienced rapid economic growth, but when prices plummeted, they fell into political and economic crisis. So, like, you think of this question, like, how can Latin America avoid this resource trap? And another key element in this tug of war for control is international trade agreements, because Latin American countries are increasingly dependent on exports to markets like the United States, China, and the European Union. And these trade relationships often tip the scales in favor of more powerful economies. And one of the most contentious issues is the control that multinational corporations wield over commodity extraction and production. Like, for example, free trade agreements like NAFTA, and which is now USMCA, and the MERCOSUR can open doors for Latin American countries to access larger markets. But they can also create situations where local industries are outcompeted, or even worse, where environmental and labor standards are sacrificed for profit. Like, take Brazil's soybean industry, for example. China, the world's largest consumer of soybeans, has exerted enormous influence over Brazil's agricultural policies. As demand for soybean grows, so does deforestation in the Amazon, with significant environmental consequences for Brazil. And this raises the question, is sovereignty being sacrificed in the pursuit of profits?
Yes, Mr. Rizwan Zaman, I see your hand is raised. Would you like to add anything?
Yes. Adding on to what Mr. Shazib Karim has said, I'd like to talk about, as he said, the environmental concerns that these exploitations of these commodities are causing. So, seeing how most countries such as Mexico and Brazil are more reliant on this agricultural exports and like the oil, which Mexico is the major producer of, it can also cut out on the um, other departments of the country. See, as when producing such products at high quantities, countries tend to lose out on other major exports that they might have, and this might lead to a saying by producers the Dutch disease, which is when the appreciation of the local currency makes other sectors of the economy less competitive, leading to a huge reliance on the commodity exports. Rather than the own personal exports of the country, and so it becomes a tipping point for the country, as if the commodities can no longer be exported, or there is any geopolitical risks such as like trade disputes or natural disasters, they'll be losing a huge part of their economy due to their over reliance on these exports.
Yeah, I would agree with Mr. Rizwan, Zaman, and Shazib Kareem. Particularly, I liked Rizwan's point regarding the Dutch disease. I was actually about to comment on that as well. But I would say, like, before coming to this podcast, I actually have a friend who's also from Latin America, and she actually told me about the rigorous and the entrenched trade dependency, the commodities dependency that Latin American countries face. For example, Chile is heavily reliant on copper, and Venezuela is heavily reliant on oil. And for example, Chile is the world's largest copper producer, and Venezuela economy is even more loop-sided, where oil once accounted for 98% of the export earnings and more than 25% of its GDP. And these numbers clearly illustrate to me that the deep dependency on a narrow range of exports, exposing these Latin American economies to a risk of commodity price volatility, especially that could take in the form of the Dutch disease, for example. And in economic terms, I would say this can be explained through the Prebisch-Singer hypothesis, which suggests that countries exporting primary commodities face deteriorating terms of trade over time. And according to this theory, the prices of the primary goods in this instances like oil or agricultural products tend to fall relative to the prices of the manufactured goods, which leads to reduced purchasing power. And as a result of this, nations will rely heavily on these exports and are often forced into a vicious cycle of low growth external debt and a dependence on foreign capital. And other than this, I would say another one of the key aspects of this topic is the role of foreign powers in shaping Latin America's economic landscape. For example, China, the United States, and the European Union have substantial interest in the Latin American commodity market and the natural resources. For example, China's influence in particular has grown over the past 2 decades. For example, let's talk about BRICS. China has become Brazil's largest trading partner and has also influenced Brazil to join BRICS, where there's a lot of Chinese influence going on. And also, there's a lot of US interest in this region as well, because Latin America is literally in the US's, I would say in some sense, the US's backyard. So obviously the US will have some sort of interest in its neighboring activities. And I would say, however, I would say this is not really a potential. It's not really a potential issue for my opinion, because foreign influence is always something that has been experienced all over the world, especially in Latin America. But I would say, in terms of foreign influence, what Latin American country needs to understand is that its foreign influence is not necessarily bad, but they might want to utilize that foreign influence to actually boost the economy of that country. So, given that statement, I would actually like to ask Mr. Rizwan Zaman a question. So, Rizwan, given the persistent challenges of the dependency of commodity in Latin America, what role do you think domestic policy plays in reducing reliance on commodities and fostering more diversified economies?
Thank you, Mr. Ari Malik, for your wonderful question. So, I believe that domestic rules and regulations must be placed and must have a huge impact on these exports of commodities. Seeing how the country is over relying on these exports, since if these commodities, as I stated before, fail, the country will have to go through a huge backlash in terms of the incomes of the country. There will be a huge, there's already a huge social impact on it, seeing how the people or the workers that are working in this commodity industry are gaining more than the other markets available in these Latin American countries. So if these were to fail, there would be a huge unemployment going throughout these countries. There's also the lack of finances that the country will have. Um, so I believe not only domestic, but also there should be the role of like multilateral institutes such as like the World Bank, the Inter-American Development Bank, or the United Nations, as they can play a crucial role in shaping the landscape of Latin America, America's markets. So, such as they can offer a wide range of financial instruments to support sustainable development projects in Latin America, such as loans, grants, or guarantees. They can also provide like technical assistance and capacity building programs, which can develop the skills and expertise, which can help them diversify from this commodity industry and market. And it could also help them cope in case the country can is going through a backlash from all the foreign affairs going around. They can also have a vital role in shaping the policy debate and advocating for sustainable development in America, seeing how most countries might look into profit rather than the well-being of their own country. Well, they are looking into the well-being of their country as they are earning money, which makes people happy, but they're also damaging their country in the process. So having these people advocate for them, they might recommend like a range of issues such as like trade policies, investment regulations, and environmental protections.
Yeah, Rizwan, I'd say I fully agree with your insights, and thank you for your insights. And Arib, I think you asked a really interesting question, and I'd also like to add my own personal insights and opinions on your question. So I'd say personally, domestic policies can actively promote the growth of all the industries beyond commodities, and governments can invest in many factors such as the manufacturing, technology, and service factors, offering subsidies, tax incentives, and support for innovation. Like, for example, countries like Chile have made strides in expanding their tech sector alongside their traditional mining industries. And this is providing a blueprint for how targeted policies can build a more balanced economy. And also another factor is strengthening the infrastructure, like investing in infrastructure such as transport, energy, and digital networks facilitates the growth of new industries. And like, robust infrastructure enables industries like tourism, technology, and renewable energy to flourish. And this is reducing reliance on raw material exports. For example, Costa Rica's investment in ecotourism infrastructure has made it a global leader in sustainable tourism, and this is also contributing significantly to the economy. And another factor is the social protection and redistribution. Like, resource-rich countries often experience inequality because the benefits of commodity exports are concentrated in the hands of a few, and domestic policies that ensure equitable distribution of wealth through progressive taxation, social safety nets, and targeted investments in healthcare and education can ensure that economic diversification efforts benefit a broader portion of the population. So I'd say that, in my opinion, like by implementing these types of domestic policies, Latin American countries can gradually shift from a dependence on commodities towards more diverse, resilient, and sustainable economies.
Thank you, everyone, for all the wonderful opinions and information that has been shared. And now, talking a little bit about the tug of war for economic sovereignty in Latin American trade markets, I think there's also a colonial root, also because the roots of Latin America's commodity dependency stretch back to the colonial period when European powers exploited the region's natural resources for the benefit of their empires. And during this time, Latin American countries were regulated to the role of resource suppliers, exporting raw materials like gold, silver, sugar, and tobacco, while importing manufacturing goods. And this colonial trade pattern set the foundation for development models centered on commodity exports. And also for this, following independence in the 19th century, many Latin American nations continue to rely on commodity exports to fuel the economies, and cycle of boom and bust became common as commodity prices fluctuated in response to a global demand. For example, Argentina prospered in the early 20th century as a leading exporter of wheat and beef, but suffered during global downturns. And Venezuela and Mexico emerged as major oil exporters, with oil revenue shaping the economies, but also making them vulnerable to the volatilities of the global oil prices. And the 20th century, I believe, also saw periods of economic nationalism, particularly in the mid-century, when countries like Mexico, Argentina, and Brazil nationalized key industries and sought to reduce their dependence on foreign capital. However, despite this efforts, the reliance on commodities remained a defining feature of their economies. And also, the resource reaches and economic vulnerability of the Latin American nations must also be brought into question here. For example, in the current era, many Latin American economies many Latin American economies rely heavily on commodity exports, and the prominent sectors include agriculture. For example, agriculture in countries like Brazil, Argentina, and Chile are major exporter of soybeans, beef, and wine, respectively. And minerals and metals. For example, Chile is also the world's largest copper producer, and Peru follows closely. And Argentina and Bolivia have vast lithium reserves, critical for the global battery industry. And oil and gas also play a major role in other countries. For example, Venezuela holds the largest proven oil reserves in the world, while Mexico and Brazil and Colombia are also significant oil producers. And while commodities contribute significantly to national GDPs and export revenues, they also create economic vulnerability. For example, fluctuations in global commodity prices can lead to severe economic instability, as seen during the 2014 to 2016 commodity price collapse, which caused recessions in several Latin American countries, most notably Brazil and Venezuela. And also, I think there's this concept of called the curse, and the concept of the resource curse is often applied to Latin American countries. It refers to the paradox where nations with abundant natural resources experience slower economic growth, weaker governance, and greater inequality compared to resource poor nations. And this phenomenon is also, I think, linked to several factors. For example, over reliance on a single sector, economies become overly dependent on commodities, neglecting the development of other sectors such as manufacturing, services. And boom of bust cycles also exist. For example, commodity prices are also notoriously volatile, and reliance on these exports make economies vulnerable to external shocks. And there's also a lot of corruption and weak institutions. The wealth generated by Latin American resource can lead to corruption and the concentration of power, as in Venezuela and Bolivia, where resource wealth has been linked to political instability. And Latin American commodity driven economies are also deeply integrated into the global markets. I think that also is very important. For example, the largest trade partners include China, which is the world's largest importer of raw materials. China has been a crucial trading partner for Latin American countries, especially Brazil, Chile, and Peru. And China also imports vast quantities of soybean, iron ore, copper, and oil. And the United States also is very plays a key role in Latin America. For example, historically, the U.S. has been a had been a major trade partner for Latin America, particularly for Mexico through the USMCA, United States Mexico Canada Agreement. And the U.S. also imports a lot of agricultural goods, oil, and manufactured products from the region. And the European Union also is, I think, a major key factor. For example, the EU is a significant news market for Latin American agriculture products, including wine, fruit, and meat. And while these trade relations provide, I think, critical revenue, they also create a lot of interdependencies. For example, Latin American economies countries are often price takers in global markets, meaning they have little control over the prices of their exports. And this is something that I learned over the summer during my summer programs. Price takers, and I think Latin American countries are price takers, not makers, which is determined by the supply of global supply of demand, supply and demand of commodities, and this leaves vulnerabilities to external conditions and shifts in the global marketplace. So, are there any more information or opinion that you would like to add to the things that I've just said, Mr. Rizwan, Zaman, Arif Malik, and Shazib Kareem?
Yes, Arav. Yeah, apologies, my mic wasn't turning on. So yeah, so regarding the concept of price taker that you were,
Apologies accepted.
yeah, Arav. So regarding the price taker that you were mentioning, so yeah, I would like to talk about that as well. So in this summer, I also learned extensively about price takers, and to elucidate on that a little bit, in economics, I would say the concept of price takers, basically refers to a market participant that has no control over the price at which they can buy or sell a product. And in the case of the Latin American markets, many Latin American countries are price takers in the global commodity market. Countries like Brazil, Chile, and Venezuela are which rely heavily on exporting raw materials, have little to no control over the prices they receive for their exports, and are therefore vulnerable to shifts in global demand, supply chains disruptions, and geopolitical events. So, for example, Chile, the world's largest copper producer, I like to use Chile as an example, is a classic example of a price taker. Despite being a major player in the copper market, Chile cannot influence the global price of copper because the commodity is traded globally and the prices are set by international markets. Instead, the Chilean producers must accept the prices set on global exchanges like the London Metal Exchange, for example. And similarly, Venezuela, despite being, if I'm not mistaken, the largest, world's largest, it has the world's largest and the world's most number of oil reserves. Despite that, it cannot set prices independently. Instead, its oil prices rise and fall with global oil prices, which are influenced by the factors ranging from the OPEC cartel decisions to changes in energy demand from countries like United States and China. So I would say price taker. Many people, I would actually like to clarify. Many people think of price takers as a negative thing, and while I admit there are cons such as vulnerability to price volatility and little to no economic sovereignty, I would say being a price taker is not necessarily bad because from my point of view, you can have access to a large market, for example, and also it gives low marketing costs because products are homogeneous and there's little differentiation between the competitors. So price takers do not need to invest heavily in branding or marketing. So I would say that's my opinion. So with that being said, I would actually like to ask Mr. Rizwan Zaman a question. I think Shazib or if you can chime in as well. So in your view, what steps should governments and firms in price taking countries should take to reduce their vulnerability and foster more economic growth?
I'm sorry, are
Thank you,
you?
Mr. Arif.
I was just gonna ask if you can repeat the question.
Oh yeah, Shazib. Yeah. So, in your view, what steps do you think the governments and the firms in the price-taking countries should prioritize to reduce their vulnerability to the global commodity market fluctuations and foster economic growth in their own sovereign countries?
Okay, got it. Yeah, Rizwan, you wanted to answer?
Yeah. So first, let's look at the cons of the price taker. So there is the limited profitability, the vulnerability to price fluctuations, and the dependency on the market forces, as stated by Mr. Arif. So I believe that some strategies that the government or firms can take is firstly like diversifying the market. So government should like actively promote economic diversification to reduce the reliance on commodities and such price takers, and thus by doing so, um, people can move away from a low wage pay as they cannot set their own prices, and they can gain more um, market share since price takers have a negligible market share, meaning their individual actions have little impact on the overall supply and demand of the commodity. Seeing how all price takers together make up the to- the end uh, the end product. So, firstly, is diversification. There could also be sustainable development projects. Firms and governments could prioritize sustainable development in their policy and regulations. This may include promoting environmental protection and social equity, seeing how, and equality, seeing how not everyone is being paid equally, and seeing how as more people are investing into these price taking uh, jobs and exports, leading to more land, more resources being used, greatly threatening the environment and also um, other jobs in the area. There could also be fiscal management. This is by implementing um, found manage revenue from commodity exports and avoid the resource curse. This may involve saving a portion of commodity revenues for future generations or investing in public services so that people can gain. Um, there could also be trade policies. Governments or firms can negotiate fair trade agreements that protect the interests of domestic producers and consumers. This may include measures to prevent dumping and unfair trade practices. Um, there could also be value-added processing, which is when firms should explore opportunities to add value to their product through like processing and manufacturing. This may help the export earnings and reduce the dependence on raw materials. They could invest in research and development to develop new products and technologies that can diversify their revenue streams and reduce their reliance on the commodities. And finally, the corporate social responsibility. So firms should adopt corporate social responsibility practices that contribute to the well-being of local communities and the environment. This may include investing in education, healthcare, and environmental projects. So by implementing these policies and strategies, Latin American governments and firms, such as in Mexico or Brazil, can work together to reduce their dependence on commodities, promoting sustainable development and improving the lives of their citizens.
Yeah, Rizwan, I'd fully agree with you, and I think to add my personal insights, like first of all, I'd like to thank Mr. Arif. Like, I think Arif, you asked a really good question, and in my opinion, price-taking countries are oftenly highly dependent on one or a few primary commodities such as oils, minerals, or agricultural products. And this dependence makes them vulnerable to price swings in global markets, which can lead to economic instability. So I think key actions which could be taken are that maybe the governments should focus on policies that encourage the growth of sectors outside the commodity space, such as manufacturing, technology, tourism, and services. And incentives like subsidies and low interest loans can help diversify the economy. For example, countries like Chile, known for copper exports, have also been fostering a thriving tech industry. And maybe instead of exporting raw materials, countries can prioritize industries that process these commodities into higher value products. For instance, instead of exporting raw coffee beans, encouraging the development of local roasting and packaging industries can help retain more of the value within the country. And I'd also say that by nurturing local entrepreneurship and SMEs, uh, governments can create a more diverse and resilient economy that is less dependent on large commodity producers. And these firms can create jobs and also drive innovation as well.
Thank you everyone for sharing your invaluable opinions. And I also like to add a little bit more about the another key fact, another nation that plays a key role in the Latin American trade markets. Again, our topic of discussion today is episode 25: Commodities and Control, the tug of war for economic sovereignty in Latin American trade markets. And that is and I would also like to talk a little bit about China's expanding influence, because the thing that I've talked about is very important. But I also believe that we should talk a little bit about China's growing role in Latin America is both an opportunity and challenge for the region. On one hand, China's demand for commodities has fueled economic growth. For example, Brazil's exports over 30% of its total goods to China, primarily soybean, iron ore, and oil. And Chile's copper industry is heavily reliant on Chinese demands, with 50% of its copper demands copper export destined for China. And however, the relationship is highly asymmetric. China exports manufactured goods and electronics to Latin America, creating a trade imbalance. And additionally, China's investments in infrastructure and resource extraction through initiatives like the Belt and Road Initiative (BRI) raises concern about Latin America's ability to maintain control over its natural resources. And countries like Ecuador, Argentina, and Peru have seen increasing Chinese involvement in their energy and mining sectors, sometimes at the expense of local sovereignty and local environmental standards. And the United States and Europe also continue to exert significant influence over Latin America's trade markets, and through free trade agreements and foreign direct investment FDI, and diplomatic relationships. However, these relationships are often seen as double-edged swords. And Mexico's dependence on the U.S. market, with 82% of its exports going to the U.S., limits its ability to diversify its trade partners. And the EU Mercosur trade agreement, though stalled, promises significant market access for both regions, but has faced opposition due to concerns over environmental degradation, particularly in the Amazon rainforest. And also there's also a battle for foreign investments and the battle for resource control. Foreign direct investment plays a crucial role in Latin America's commodity sectors. Multinational corporations, particularly from the US, China, and Europe, dominate industries such as mining, oil, and agriculture. While FDI brings capital, technology, and jobs, it also raises questions about the control of natural resources. And in countries like Chile and Peru, foreign mining companies dominate the copper industry, leading to tensions over profit, recuperation, and environmental impacts. And in Argentina's Vaca Muerta, one of the largest shale and gas reserves in the world. Foreign investment is essential for development, but there are also concerns that too much control is ceded to foreign interests. And special Latin American countries have also attempted several Latin American countries also attempted to reclaim control over the natural resources through nationalization policies. For example, Venezuela's nationalization of its key oil industry in the early 2000s under President Hugo Chavez is one of the prominent examples. However, the country is not one of the best cases because of the policies implemented by Hugo Chavez that eventually led to the economic collapse in Venezuela. And similarly, Bolivia nationalized its key industry, gas industry under President Evo Morales. And Mexico has also has had a long state controlled oil industry through Pemex. And while nationalizations can increase government revenue and asset control over resources, it also has drawbacks. Poor management, corruption, and underinvestment in nationalized industries can lead to inefficiencies and declining production, as seen in Venezuela, where oil production has plummeted despite having the world's largest reserves. So, are there any more opinions or information that you would like to add to the things that I've just said, Mr. Shazib Karim, Mr. Rizwan Zaman, or Mr. Ari Malik? Mr. Shazib Karim, I see your hand is raised. Would you like to add anything?
Yeah, sure. Araf Malik, and my own personal insights. And first of all, Araf, thank you for your insights. And I think you brought up a really interesting point about China's influence in Latin America, which has grown significantly over the past 2 decades. And in my opinion, I'd say that they have had like several like huge influence on the region, like mainly because of their investments. Because we can see that China has also become a key investor in the region with investments across a wide range of sectors, like energy and mining, for example. Like Chinese firms have invested heavily in energy infrastructure, oil fields, and mining operations across Latin America. And China's involvement in countries like Venezuela, Ecuador, Brazil is particularly strong in the oil sector, where Chinese companies often operate fields or provide financing in exchange for long-term supply contracts. And through China's Belt and Road Initiative (BRI), China has funded large-scale infrastructure projects in Latin America, including highways, ports, and railways. And these projects aim to facilitate trade between the two regions and provide China with greater access to Latin America's resources and markets. And another factor is, while much of China's focus has been on natural resources, there's also growing Chinese investment in manufacturing and industrial sectors in countries like Mexico and Brazil. And also we can also look at the political and diplomatic influence as well, because China's expanded economic ties with Latin America have also translated into greater political influence in the region. Many Latin American countries have increasingly turned to China as a counterbalance to the United States, seeking to diversify their international relations. And one notable example of China's growing political fame in Latin America is the Taiwan issue. Over the past 2 decades, several countries in the region have switched diplomatic recognition from Taiwan to China in exchange for economic incentives, loans, and investments. Like, for example, Panama, the Republic, and El Salvador are recent examples of this diplomatic shift. And China has also deepened its participation in Latin American multilateral organizations and forums, such as the China CELAC, which stands for Community of Latin America and Caribbean States Forum. And these platforms allow China to strengthen its political ties with the region and foster collaboration on a wide range of issues, from trade and investment to climate change and technology.
All right, Malik, I see your hand is raised. Would you like to add anything?
Yes. So I would like to add to the fact that we haven't really talked about this much, but there's also an environmental and social cost over the commodities market in the Latin American region. So, for example, in the Amazon region of Brazil, for example, vast swaths of forest have been cleared to grow soybeans, which account for a significant portion of the Brazilian export earnings. And one of my good friends, his name is Wow, and I met him this summer in Boston. So he told me that the Brazil has experienced a lot of deforestation in the Amazon region, and this has led to a lot of problems, particularly among the indigenous tribes that actually live in these Amazonian regions. And also, not only that, we also know the Amazon forest is the lungs of the earth. But due to the increasing amount of deforestation and the poor policies that were employed by Bolsonaro's government, the Amazon rainforest has faced environmental degradation, which is frankly concerning. Firstly, because of climate change, but also from an economical standpoint, it also includes several huge social cost of Brazil. And I would say, other than that, there's also a risk of I would say, other than that, there's also a risk of, I would say, socio-political instability. For example, in Bolivia, I was researching about this. The lithium mining industry has sparked tension between the government, the local indigenous groups, and the environmental activists. And as Bolivia seeks to capitalize on this massive lithium reserves, vital for the electric vehicle industries, there are disputes over who controls these resources and how the benefits should be distributed. How the benefits should be distributed, and this has become increasingly, I would say, contentious. And moreover, there's a phenomena which I believe is called resource nationalism, which tends to flare up in the commodity dependent countries, where local populations demand greater control over and benefits from their natural resources, and governments sometimes respond by expropriating or increasing taxes on foreign companies, which can lead to reduced foreign investment and economic uncertainty. For example, Venezuela's oil industry nationalization under Hugo Chavez is one of the most prominent examples, but similar movements have been also seen in Argentina, Ecuador, and Bolivia. And I would say, other than that, long-term sustainability challenge is also something that we should be worried about, because Latin American countries rich in commodities face a sustainability paradox. While their natural resources have historically driven growth, continuous reliance on unsustainable extraction could jeopardize future economic stability and social well-being. And this is also some of the concerns in the Middle Eastern countries, which are heavily dependent on oil and natural gas. For example, I always think United Arab Emirates is one of the best examples on earth. In the United Arab Emirates, it was greatly dependent on oil and natural resources like 20 years from now, or like 10 years from now. But right now, if we look at what constitutes the GDP of the United Arab Emirates, the oil share has significantly gone down from what it was like 20 years ago. And this is because United Arab Emirates, and I would say Saudi Arabia, and also at the moment, are diversifying their economy through tourism, through sports, and also through making their countries more business friendly, so that they have increased foreign investment in their countries. So I would say this Latin America could potentially develop from employing similar tactics. But I would say at the moment, what Latin America should focus on is first developing their countries. So developing their countries, and also like making sure that they do not destroy too much of the environment, because the social cost and the negative externalities are really concerning. Oh, I see, Rizwan. Rizwan, you have your hand raised. Would you like to comment on this, or do you have anything else in mind?
Yep. So what I would like to talk about is like the effect of these commodities on like the social um, factor in this country, such as there is the factor of illegal mining that's been going around due to these high stakes exports of commodities. Particularly, there's like been a huge influx in like coal mining, which is a huge contributor of deforestation in Colombia. There's also mining done in Brazil and other countries, which have huge negative impacts on on the environment of these countries. There's also armed conflict, the illegal drug trade fueled by the cocoa cultivation has been a major conflict. And has led to disputes of communities, human rights violations, and environmental degradations. There is the labor exploitations. So workers in the mining and agriculture sectors may face poor working conditions, low wages, and limited labor rights, which can contribute to social inequality and poverty. Um, there is also the factor of the indigenous communities, as, such as the Quincua in Ecuador, the Guarani in Brazil, the Yamara in Bolivia, or the Mam in Guatemala, which are facing huge displacement from their traditional lands, which can disrupt their livelihoods, cultural practices, and access to natural resources. So, to address some of these environmental and social concerns, like some steps that could be taken are like environmental regulations. The government can implement stricter environmental regulations to protect biodiversity and reduce pollution. This can also be done by external global help, such as from the United Nations or other countries such as China, Japan, or America. Uh, and this could fuel for a better future for the next generation of these Latin American countries. There could be social impact assessments done on companies that are exploiting these commodities. Um, this way, they this way they can understand and be more thoughtful about their processes of undertaking new exports, mining projects, or deforestation projects for their upcoming. um, exports. They, governments or firms can also have community engagements so that they which can engage greater involvement of local communities in decision-making processes related to mining and other extraction industries, as most frequently these communities are not told about these projects and are often forcefully removed from their lands uh, through violence or um, armed means which are very bad for their livelihoods and things like that. And additionally, there could be funds such as the Amazon Fund, which was created in 2008, which provides financial resources for the conservation of the Amazon rainforest, seeing how a lot of the indigenous people and the local communities are hugely affected and impacted by the Amazon rainforest. There's also uh, the huge tourism industry in the Amazon, seeing how tons of people come and visit the place, and this gives the country a huge boost in income, and as such. And finally, of course, the indigenous land rights, uh, giving these indigenous people their right to say or to give protects the land and proves a greater social benefit for the people of the country.
Thank you, everyone, for sharing all the invaluable opinions. Now, I believe for the future of economic sovereignty in Latin American trade markets, I think diversification is a key path. For example, to reduce dependency on commodities and regain greater control over their economies, Latin American countries must diversify their export bases, and some nations have begun to invest in technology services. Chile and Mexico are investing in technology hubs and digital services to create more balanced economies. And Brazil is also leader in biofuels, and countries like Chile and Colombia are expanding their renewable energy sectors, particularly solar and wind power, to reduce reliance on fossil fuels and create new export opportunities. And there's also a stronger regional integration that could help Latin American countries increase their bargaining power on the global stage and reduce their dependence on external markets. And initiatives like the Pacific Alliance and Mercosur have the potential to boost inter-regional trade and cooperation, though political differences and protectionisms have often limited their effectiveness. And by working together, Latin American nations could develop more resilient economies that are less vulnerable to the fluctuations of global commodity markets and better able to maintain control over their natural resources. So, what do you think? What could the Latin American economies do in the future to reduce dependence on other nations and to regain their economic sovereignty when it comes to commodities? Mr. Arif Malik Shazib Karimor, Mr. Rizwan Zaman.
As we stated before, some of the things that these Latin American countries could do is diversifying their economies. This can be done with the help of foreign countries such as China or America, which play a huge part in the export of commodities. There could also be international organizations that could work in this that could work alongside these countries, such as the United Nations or other organizations set for the benefit of these Latin American countries. So, by diversifying the exports, by having either a huge influx in the education of these countries, can lead to people moving into other sectors and being less reliant on these exports. There could also be uh, greater funds given to these countries so that they can undertake development in other sectors, can uh, help them create better job opportunities for people not in these export businesses. There could also be rules and regulations placed in case these exports collapse, seeing how a lot of these countries are benefiting from their exported commodities. And since all of these commodities are influenced by the global power, there could be a fall in the prices and demand for such products. And so these countries could hopefully create a backup plan for those workers and people involved in those sectors so that they could um, have a future even if their main line of work is gone. Um, they could uh, they could also ask help from the IMF, the International Monetary Fund, to provide like financial assistance and policy advice to help countries maintain their future economic stability. This is particularly important for countries that are heavily dependent on commodity exports, such as Brazil, who have their huge export on agriculture, or and there could also be the following of the SDG goals, so including goals related to poverty reduction, hunger eradication, and environmental protection. And these Latin American countries can use this goal as a framework for sustainable development and to address the social and environmental impacts of commodity dependence in the future. And finally, I'd like to talk about how uh, countries in the future uh, might be affected by the uh, illegal and harmful effects that might happen. And so I believe these countries would um, look into um, more peace agreements and rural development, seeing how most of these uh, community exports take up a lot of the area, um, all of the underprivileged areas in the country, and they usually force out the local inhabitants of the area. So by having um, like rural development programs to support small scale farmers and promoting sustainable agriculture, they can diversify their means and also develop other financial uh, gains.
Mr. Arif Malik
Yeah.
and Mr. Shazikoy, would you like to add anything?
Yeah, I'm about to run now, and Rizwan, thank you for your insights. I'd agree with you, and I think Araf Malik, you brought up an interesting topic about diversification, which is, of course, really important and significant because, in my opinion, I'd say it's important because, instead of focusing solely on exporting raw materials, Latin American countries can increase their income by developing industries that process these materials into higher value goods. And this adds value domestically before export and creates jobs and new industries. So I think some actions which can be taken is countries that export agricultural products like, for example, soybeans, coffees, cocoa, and others. They can establish processing industries. For example, instead of exporting raw coffee beans, developing local coffee roasting, packaging, and branding businesses can create a higher value product for export. And countries can also promote light and heavy manufacturing by creating industrial zones, providing incentives for companies to produce goods domestically, and investing in infrastructure that supports manufacturing. And another thing that can be done is, they can establish partnerships with foreign companies to ensure that technology and knowledge transfer happens. And this can help local businesses upgrade their processes and move into more advanced industries. And another factor could be to, of course, we already talked about strengthening the infrastructure, but another factor might be to develop and expand the technology sector. And it's because technology is a high growth sector that offers opportunities for innovation, job creation, and export diversification. And Latin American countries can establish themselves as tech hubs, providing services and products that are not tied to commodity markets. So I think the actions that could be taken is the governments can offer incentives such as tax breaks and grants to attract tech startups. and encouraging partnerships between local universities and the private sector can also promote tech innovation. And maybe they can also develop tech parks and innovation zones that provide infrastructure and resources for tech companies to collaborate, innovate, and grow. And countries like Brazil have successfully developed tech hubs in cities like Sao Paulo as well. And I'd say another factor is to diversifying export markets and products. And I'd say that the diversifying export markets reduces reliance on a single country or region. And while expanding the range of export products beyond commodities helps avoid dependence on raw materials. And uh, so maybe the actions that could be taken is maybe they can seek new trade agreements with regions outside of traditional markets like the US and China, such as the European Union, Africa, or Asia Pacific. And diversifying trade relationships reduces vulnerability to economic shifts in a single market. And also focus on exporting more processed goods, such as electronics, machinery, or pharmaceuticals, rather than raw commodities. And countries like Mexico have successfully transitioned to exporting manufactured goods, such as automobiles and electronics. And also to identify and promote niche products such as organic food, ecotourism, or sustainable fashion that appeal to high income consumers globally.
I think that brings to the end of our discussion here. And based on our discussion, I believe that we can conclude that the tug of war for economic sovereignty in Latin American trade markets is defined by the region's heavy dependence on commodities and its struggle to maintain control over its natural resources. And while foreign investment, trade relationships, and nationalization efforts have provided both opportunities and challenges, Latin American countries must navigate a complex landscape of global competition, environmental concerns, and social tensions. And achieving greater economic sovereignty will require a multifaceted approach that includes diversifying economies, promoting sustainable development, and strengthening regional cooperation. Only by addressing these challenges can Latin American nations must truly take control of their economic futures and ensure that the vast natural resources benefit their populations in the long term. So, is that a conclusion that everyone would agree with?
Yeah, Araf, I agree with that.
Yes, Mr. Arafalik, I believe that is the perfect conclusion to this discussion.
What about Mr.
I
Arif Malik?
concur. Yes, I concur to that statement.
Thank you for every one of your agreements, and I think that brings to the end of our discussion here, which was episode 25. Episode 25, commodities and control: the tug of war for economic sovereignty in Latin America's trade markets, with Mr. Rizwan Zaman. Mr. Rizwan Zaman, thank you so much for coming into this episode. Are there any final words that you would like to say before we depart for today?
Yeah, I would like to thank you guys for involving me in this discussion. I also thank everyone watching this video, as I had fun discussing about this topic, seeing how this has a huge social environmental effect, and it's also something that most Latin American, like all Latin American countries, are going through and struggling with. And so I believe this was a very fruitful discussion, and I absolutely loved it. Thank you for including me in this discussion.
Thank you, Mr. Rizwan Zaman, for joining into the discussion. I believe that brings to the end of our discussion today, which was episode 25, Commodities and Control, the tug of war for economic sovereignty, Latin America's trade markets. Thank you to the audience for listening into this week's discussion, and I hope that you enjoyed it. And we hope to see you next week with another very interesting guest speaker with another very interesting topic. Thank you. And